Hey guys, so I wanted to talk a little bit today about the word ego and what I mean when I use that word ego. And I know that Freud and in psychology, they might use that word in a certain way to mean certain something. And then it may be different than the way it's used in Buddhism and in classical yoga and the way that I use it. I think that I use it in the way that yoga and Buddhism uses it. And I'm not sure, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, I'm not sure if that's the same way it's used in Western psychology. So it may be important to clarify terms because I want to be sure we're talking about the same thing. I suspect it may be a very similar, if not identical, concept, but it's just good. What are we talking about when we're talking about the ego? So the ego, in a very simple way to put it, is a false sense of self or center, a false identity. And basically, according to yoga and Buddhism, you could say that our suffering, especially I know in the yoga tradition, this is how it's viewed. If you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali carefully, you see that it all comes down to sort of this false, this confusion, what in yoga is called avidya. So part of that is this false sense of self, and we call that false sense of self the ego. And the ego is basically an illusion, which means it doesn't really exist. So we might say, well, how can something that doesn't exist create so many problems for us, right? You would think if something doesn't exist, then it's not a problem. It's not really there. But that's not really true, is it? And the traditional example that's given in the yoga tradition is, I think, in India, especially when yoga first started gaining in prominence, there were a lot of snakes. And so I think a common mistake or thing that would happen to people is they might see a rope that had been coiled up and put in a room somewhere, and they might mistake that for a snake that's been coiled up and is there, might bite them. So the tradition says that if you are walking and maybe it's twilight and you're walking along and you look over and you see this coiled up snake and you jump in fright and then you trip and you fall and you hit your head. Is that creating a problem for you? Absolutely it is, right? You hit your head, that's real. You're bleeding, that's real. But let's say you lay there unconscious until daylight. And with daylight, you slowly wake up, you're holding your head, and you get up and you look at the snake and you see it's a coiled up rope. Was there ever really a snake there? No, there was never a snake there. That was confusion, what in yoga is called avidya, or again, you could say an illusion. Very often in Buddhism, they refer to delusion. I don't really care about terms that much. I studied philosophy, and terms is called semantics. And so I tend to, in my teaching, choose a term, and I try and stick with that term. Because we can have a lot of different terms and there can be shades. So it can be useful to have many different terms that maybe just denote a slight different shade of something, a little bit, a nuance with something. It might not be exactly the same thing, but it's similar. So, was there ever a snake there? No. Did it cause us a problem? Yes, because we were confused. So, according to Buddhism and yoga, and I'm taking some liberties with the terminology. So if if you're a scholar or you know about these traditions, I'm going to use certain terms from these traditions interchangeably. Even though within those traditions they may not feel that these are interchangeable terms, I'm going to take liberty because I've studied both pretty in depth. And so for me, given my experience and my training, these things are similar enough. They essentially point to the same thing that I'm going to use them interchangeably, because for my students, they're more or less going to mean the same thing. So, according to the yogic and Buddhist tradition, we don't really have a self. Okay, so you're sitting there listening to me right now, you're like, yeah, I've got a self, I'm right here. But it's not what you think it is. That's the key. You think this body is your self. That, according to yoga and Buddhism, is already, you're confused. You're now mistaking the rope for the snake. And you're going to say, nope, I'm sure it's me, this is me, this is me. Well, if this hand is you, like Red, I say, oh, is this you? Yeah, it's me. Well, let's say we chop off your hand. Okay, now it's sitting over there. You're here, your hand's over there on the floor. Is it still you? It was you a second ago, but now you're sitting there looking at it. Now you might say, okay, fine, you chop off my hand, now it's no longer part of my body. My body is me, so anything that's attached to my body is me. And I don't want to get too far into it today because I want to keep this about 10 minutes, this talk. But if you study philosophy like I did, that idea also doesn't hold water. It really doesn't. And again, if you want to discuss this with me in detail, I can take you through there are various thought experiments that you use in philosophy to determine that. Well, the idea that my body is me is problematic. What if I clone my body? What if I'm put in another body, right? There's many ideas. I'm watching a science fiction show right now called Altered Carbon on Netflix, and they have this idea that you can take the human consciousness and put it into different bodies. Well, is it you? If the body is you, then that's a problem. Now, a lot of people don't have a problem saying, okay, I'm not my body, but then what they want to say is, on my thoughts, or on my memory, or on my emotions. These are also problematic. And over time, again, maybe in one of these talks, or in a session one-on-one, or on a retreat, I can show you how that also is just as problematic. Whatever it is that we try and identify with that has a form is problematic in terms of our identity. And so both the Buddhist and the Tantric yoga tradition, these traditions dive very deep into the nature of consciousness. And they found basically that this sense of self, this separate sense of self, does not really exist. And when I refer to ego, I'm referring to this separate sense of self. Now, why would we want to get rid of this separate sense of self, right? If it's, who cares? Okay, I have this illusion, but I'm happy. Well, the answer is, if you're happy, you don't need to get rid of it. But you really need to be honest about whether you're happy or not. And you have to realize that there might be a level of joy and happiness and contentment in human life that you have not yet experienced, that is above and beyond the average. And that's been my experience. By studying these traditions and doing the practices that they prescribe, very important, not just studying, not just understanding intellectually, but doing the practices, it has transformed my life, and I absolutely experience a level of joy, freedom, and happiness that I didn't even know was possible before. And I think this is true for most people. They don't realize how incredible this gift of a human life can be. How do we access that incredible life? We begin to weaken and then eventually dissolve the ego. How do we do that? It's involved. I'm not going to say it's simple or easy, although in a sense it is, but it requires practice, it requires guidance, and that's what Mahapatha Yoga is all about. So you're watching this, congratulations, you're on the path. Anyway, guys, I want to keep it short. We're at 10 minutes. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something from that. As usual, reach out if there's some way that I can help support you during this time. I know it's a very stressful time. Speaking of support, if you feel that you want to support me and this community of yogis, please make a donation. There should be information below this video somewhere, whether this is on YouTube or on the Patreon site. I definitely could use your support, and when you support me with donations, it means I don't have to charge for these videos, and then they're available for people who might be out of work or can't afford to pay. Thank you so much, everyone. Namaste, and have a lovely day.